We live in uncertain times. Thanks to being blindsided by a global pandemic of the COVID-19 coronavirus, it's already affected all of our lives in astonishing ways, from social distancing measures to the canceling of major sporting events like the Summer Olympics and the NBA season, to it being almost impossible to get food, hand sanitizer, or toilet paper in supermarkets. Nobody really knows how long this thing is going to last, but some experts have posited that it could last as long as 18 months or more. With the United States 2020 presidential election only 7 months away, what might happen if the pandemic is still active then? You may have heard that this whole situation will have blown over by mid-April, but realistically, that's unlikely to be how things are going to shape up. Cases are accelerating in the thousands every single day, and even with the social distancing measures, people are still going to be infected and are still going to die. If social distancing measures are relaxed too soon, cases will spike again, and some estimate that the number of deaths could enter the millions. In other words, yes, we're in this thing for the long haul, and elections in November will likely be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has already delayed Democratic primary voting in Louisiana, Georgia, Maryland, Puerto Rico, Ohio, and Kentucky. There's a logical reason for this. While there's a small percentage of the country who vote by domestic mail and international absentee ballot, the grand majority of American voters cast their vote in physical polling stations. Huge amounts of people gathering in tightly confined spaces for hours while waiting to vote presents a huge risk for transmission on a mass scale. Even worse, polling stations are often held in retirement homes, and poll workers tend to skew older, meaning huge numbers of people are put at a significant health risk simply by showing up to vote. If the same thing happened on the day of the general election in November, the results would have the potential to be utterly catastrophic. So where will it end? The most obvious question that comes to mind is, will President Trump just call the whole thing off and hold the election again at a later date when the COVID-19 pandemic is finally over? The simple, conventional answer is no, not legally at least. The date of the federal election was set in stone by a federal statute known as the Presidential Election Day Act, established all the way back in 1845. The act specifies in what almost seems more like a riddle than a law: the electors of the president and vice president shall be appointed in each state on the Tuesday next after the first Monday of the month of November of the year in which they are to be appointed. The sitting president is incapable of shifting the date, even with emergency powers and an executive order. Also, you may have noticed some interesting terminology there: the electors. That's because the citizens of the United States don't technically vote to appoint their president. They vote to appoint their state elector, who then elects the president. This system is known as the Electoral College. In theory, the individual states could move to change the process by which they appoint their electors to make it a little more COVID-19 friendly, but this would involve getting unanimous approval from the state legislatures and governors of all 50 states. To push this motion through the gate before November 3rd, this year's election date, would probably be as complicated as it would be unpopular with the electorate at large. In other words, in the unlikely event that the election was postponed, it probably wouldn't happen like that. As anyone familiar with the United States Constitution will tell you, only a united Congress can postpone an election in the event of a crisis. They would need to essentially rewrite the Presidential Election Day Act. But even this would only delay the election by a few months, and if the COVID-19 pandemic is still raging in November, it would still just be as much of a problem in December and January. To delay the election any longer would involve literally rewriting the Constitution, which would provide its own series of complications. Also, delaying the election wouldn't actually increase President Trump's term length. According to the 20th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, if not re-elected by the will of the people, a president's 4-year term ends at noon on January 20th following an election year. President Trump would be forced to step down, and the leader of the House would temporarily assume the role of acting president until the next election could take place. Essentially, there's almost no legal method of delaying or postponing the election that wouldn't be a complete organizational nightmare. There's no real precedent for doing this either. Elections have occurred during the Civil War, 2 months after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and during World War II. Even the Japanese American citizens held in Japanese internment camps during World War II were allowed to vote by mail. Pandemics of the past haven't stopped elections either. During the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918 to 1919, which killed over 670,000 people in the United States, a midterm election was still held, albeit with a horrifically low voter turnout, and turnout is one of the decisive factors here. Because while many would go to the polls on election day and get infected, many would just stay home. If the election was held as normal on November 3rd, the country would probably experience historically low voter turnout, and some pundits have even expressed fears that this could be used to some people's political advantage. One example being that President Trump's use of the presidential text alert system might spread dangerous misinformation about the status of polling stations across the country, but these fears aren't necessarily founded in evidence. So chances are the election isn't going to be postponed or delayed. This leaves us with only two options: changing nothing and potentially risking a massively exacerbated COVID-19 pandemic, or modifying the election itself to potentially reduce the risk of infection, as a number of constitutional and election scholars have suggested. You're probably wondering how exactly you can virus-proof an election, but thankfully we have some answers for you on that one. The two suggestions most commonly put forward by voting rights advocates is adopting complete online voter registration and mass adoption of mail voting. Online voter registration is described by many as a common-sense policy, seeing as it's an extremely simple and effective way of helping eligible Americans register to vote without posing any infection risks to their fellow citizens. By this same token, there are calls for all states to enable same-day voter registration, or even automatic voter registration, in order to ensure the maximum number of eligible Americans are able to register to vote. These systems would be an excellent way to potentially mitigate the low voter turnout that COVID-19 would cause. But of course, introducing mass mail voting is the most in-demand policy for a COVID-19 friendly presidential election. Mail voting would not only massively reduce face-to-face contact in the voting process, it would also allow for many Americans who don't typically vote, such as poor or marginalized groups whose care responsibilities and work schedules hold them back from getting to the polls on election day, to participate in the democratic system. This does, however, come with certain caveats. The first is that it will fundamentally change a lot of those actual mechanics of election day. A 90% mail vote election would not yield a definitive result the night of November 3rd like we're used to. The results could take days or even weeks to properly process into definitive outcomes. That being said, this delay would be nothing compared to the delay of actually postponing the election as a whole, so it's a relatively small drawback. A slightly bigger complication is the fact that the United States is a multilingual nation, and polling stations by law are obligated to provide voting cards in the native language of the voter. In order to get around this in a mass mail voting world, the government would need to record people's native languages during the registration in order to make sure they were sending all voters the appropriate voting cards. This, in and of itself, would take quite some time to organize, with the November 3rd deadline looming. Most states would need to also build entirely new infrastructure to count all the paper ballots, compared to the electronic voting machines used in polling stations across the country. This would take extra state and federal funding to help rebuild and reinforce the new infrastructure, and whether the government would be willing to allocate those funds is an open question. Why not just transition the voting to online, is the question you're probably asking right now. Well, that presents some serious problems too. You probably remember hearing stories of hacking and interference during the 2016 presidential election, and that's because even electronic voting machines, which typically have high standards of security and encryption, are vulnerable to these attempts at infiltration. Servers connecting to over 300 million American personal computers would not only be notoriously buggy, they'd also be extremely vulnerable to outside hacking attempts. You'll often find that updating voting methods is always a conflict between increasing voter rights while also protecting the security of the voting system. Also, while widespread mail voting would help reduce the potential COVID-19 risk, it would be unwise to close all polling stations and adopt 100% mail voting because of the select groups of voters this would disenfranchise. For example, Native American communities typically have a P.O. box rather than a conventional home address, meaning that mail voting wouldn't really work. The same thing applies to America's large populations of homeless people, whether they're sleeping rough on the streets or living in hotel rooms and vehicles. While it's vital to protect people from COVID-19 infection in November, it isn't an excuse to deny vulnerable groups their constitutional right to vote. The polling stations kept open will just have to engage in extra precautions as mandated by the CDC. Voting machines will likely be disinfected thoroughly between uses, and lines for the voting booths would be single file with 6 feet of distance between voters. Measures would also need to be put in place in order to protect the poll workers, such as disinfectant, facial protection, and reserve staff that would allow each employee to interact with fewer people. Much like the new infrastructure developed for the influx of mail votes, developing polling stations precautions would take some overhead that would need to be funded by the state and federal government. The real question now is whether the government will actually plan and approve all this new infrastructure prior to the November 3rd presidential election. The answer is no, probably not. The government hasn't been known for its efficiency in the past, and considering that the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic so far has done little to halt the spread, the most likely scenario for November is that nothing will be done and elections will carry on as normal. This will most likely result in extremely low voter turnout and a large spike in infections that would carry the pandemic into next year. Hopefully this won't be the case, but as of March 2020, there has been no hard and fast electoral planning to suggest otherwise. One final question we might ask is how the pandemic might actually affect the results of the November presidential election. According to most professional speculation on the matter, the result is likely to depend on two main factors: the death rates over the next several months, and COVID-19's effect on the market. If deaths are kept relatively low and the market endures or recovers by November, President Trump's re-election is much more likely. If the world slips into another global financial recession as a result of COVID-19, this is likely to jeopardize his chances of re-election. The overall reality of the situation is that we're living in unprecedented times. Nobody knows what the next several months will hold, and the world seems to undergo rapid changes every single day. Whether the pandemic will be around during the 2020 presidential election is still, to some degree, an open question, but planning for the worst-case scenario is the best course of action either way. Thanks for watching this episode of The Infographic Show. Still hungry for more information about how the United States is dealing with our current pandemic? Why not check out why new coronavirus COVID-19 could be deadlier pandemic than SARS, and United States' plan for a pandemic. In the meantime, stay indoors, wash your hands, and avoid social contact.